I just kind of came up with this as we were talking, and I don't think that we've missed any guests that this applied to, and if we have, I'm sorry. However, I think you may be the first guest we've had so far that has lived in both Los Angeles and New York.
Okay.
And I thought it might be nice to ask our guests that have had that experience to give some sort of comparison, what they thought about both locations, and kind of, because those two cities are the most compared cities, frequently compared.
Well, they're the largest population cities in the country.
And they're also, in terms of creation of creative output, two prominent, if not the most two prominent cities.
Yeah, I guess in our particular industries, world, creative-wise, there's a lot of like, am I going to be on the West Coast or the East Coast? Am I going to be bi-coastal? What am I going to do?
Yeah. What does that? Yeah. What are those reputations?
So I guess so this will be a two-part direction.
Wait, I want to understand one question before you go.
Of course, yeah.
So you're saying you asked people this, but none of them?
I don't. This is the first time this question is being asked because I don't think any guest has had this experience. Okay. But I think we will have other people that'll have this experience at some point.
I see.
So I guess, because you're not originally from New York, but if you could tell us about, your original coming here, and then, your experiences of LA, and we'll just go from there.
Sure. I came to I'm from New England, so I have closer familiarity with New York. Came here intermittently when I was a kid, saw a Broadway show, did a summer camp program, other things, and then when I was applying for college, I did apply to some schools in California, but I hadn't been that often, and it was so much farther away. My family definitely was concerned, I think, with the idea of me being so far from home. So when I was accepted to new school, I felt like that was the way to go, and I did like the energy of New York, the intensity of the place. So that was part of the draw for me. And I think it was a really fun experience to be here in college. Jesse and I, plenty of memories, plenty of fun experiences. Having New York as your campus, as they pitch it, is cool, but also very different than they pitch it, right? Like, it's actually a lot more of a bubble than you realize in certain ways. It's very self-referential and very like insular in a really interesting way, because I think, like you get exposed to people from different places and different elements, but it's also, there's this like gravity to this place that kind of keeps you centered here. And to my experience, didn't feel like I got lost, certainly at certain times in Manhattan and in Brooklyn and different boroughs, like try to give myself adventures, but I also felt like there was always the subway, there were always people around. I was guarded and smart enough, and I had to build up more of a guard from college here, that I think I was, by the end of the 4 years, really conscious of the fact that I was somewhat jaded and somewhat avoidant of being as open creatively as I wanted to be. Which is part of the reason I left the city, I think. I felt enough awareness of New York as a place that I knew I would have to commit myself to being here for like 10 years to make enough money, get by, and like live the way I wanted to. It was a moment of economic downturn again, so that was also this like, it's going to be really hard. It was going to be really hard in LA, but I thought like, at least in LA I'm starting new. I get to be the new kid in a new place, and the quality of life and the expectations of how you live are different. And I just felt like by the end of school, everyone goes through a lot, the college experience, but I'd had a lot of transitions with my family and my life overall, that I also recognized like my surroundings were changing, and me staying in the same place was not going to serve me mentally the way that I needed it to.
Right.
Which is all motivation as to why I came to LA. And going to LA definitely, I think, forced me open again in a different way. Finding creative communities, finding audiences. I think anybody after college is like doing that anyway. Doing it without the same network or without the established relationships that I'd created here was more challenging than I'd expected. And I definitely think I like came into LA with this like glamorous expectation that I somehow would meet and formulate a whole creative community there that would be comparable to my experience in New York. And that's just not the case, you know. It's a different world. Everybody's spread out. You might have a community, but you also have to have a very deep investment in maintaining it. I think you have to do that here as well, but it's you can also just run into people.
Right.
Or it's easier for people to meet up, and depending on there are people you might not see in LA or you might not collaborate with, but they'll like be in the periphery, and ideally one day you'll align, but you won't necessarily have that opportunity for a while, you know? So I guess any more specifics about LA I would be happy to share, but I just think that I spent 4 years there, 4 years here, and again, at the end of the 4 years in LA, things in terms of my family and my life, I felt like were coming to a point where I don't know if I've just been on a 4-year track, and this is like a loop I come back to, so there was this cycle of evaluation after 4 years, but it feels like the kind of place I realized that at that point I wasn't finding and self-actualizing myself the way that I had hoped I would there. I think there were certain things I became better at, certain moments where I self-actualized and got over a hump, but then it's easy to slump back into it, and depending on what's going on otherwise, there's so much other context that can inform your creative practice.
Yeah.
And inform the people you're around. And I've heard the analogy about LA, like New York is kind of like a river. If we're gonna go bodies of water.
Uh-huh.
Sure.
New York is kind of a river. You go with the flow. It's constantly moving and shifting and progressing in some form or another, and you can catch it or you can't, or you can like jump out of the water and then back in, and you'll be moving the whole time. LA is more of like a lake or a pond where you get in the water, and if you stay in your area, you'll stay with the circumstances you're in. And if you really want something, you can get to the other end of the lake or the other end of the pond, but you have to perpetually be swimming yourself, taking yourself on that journey through that. And that, because it's all so spread out, and because there's this motivation or this manifest destiny mindset, it's partially that I think that people have to constantly continue to recreate and reevaluate and reformulate. Whereas in New York, things evolve and just become something new without much realization until it's already happened, right? Like this park just built in time, who knew? So yeah, I guess those are my comparisons. There's definitely neighborhoods and places that are geographically, I would compare, like socioeconomically similar.
Right.
And I've had plenty of people, not every time, there are plenty of folks from the Northeast that when I tell them I lived in LA, or when anyone else from LA that lived in LA talks about it, there's so much disdain and resentment and judgment of the place.
Yeah.
I don't have that, and I refuse to view it that way. My house caught on fire before I left LA, and my car was stolen. Like, these are unfortunate events, but I believe it was it's a special place, and I have a deep affection for it. I just know that it's ultimately not what has motivated me and supported me growing.
Yeah.
Or it did up to a point, and I realized that I'd reached that point.
Yeah.
And maybe it'll do it again someday, but for now, I needed to be somewhere else.
Yeah. So I think I could infer the answer to this question based on your analogy. But if you were to say, kind of, when you talk about your self-actualization, the ratio to which that actualization was internally motivated versus externally motivated, like the actual city itself, doing something to you, it sounds like that in your experience that the changes that occurred while in LA were internally motivated, whereas in New York they might be acting on you just kind of as a day-to-day thing?
Yeah, sure, I'd say that. I think that's part of what's good and difficult for me about New York as well, is that, like, their external motivations or external events that self-actualize you or motivate you into action, but that kind of forces more reactionary behavior occasionally, or constantly. So when I was in LA and I was deciding I was coming back to New York, I made some decisions in terms of my career path where I was like, I've been working in film. I didn't want to commit to one avenue of the industry, and I recognized that I was also working in places and spaces, and that I'd been working in that realm, and so I wanted to push myself towards parks and push myself towards just like facilities. And I think that served me well in transitioning back to New York. But then once I got into this world, I think that like it's taken on more shape, and I've just kind of been constantly either catching up or like fighting it. And I think that's not really the way you want to work in a career, I don't think, so that's part of where like my next phase or my next ambition is kind of recognizing all of that and trying to think through how I can avoid doing that again, making that same mistake the same way. LA's internal choices, I found a theater I liked. I self-actualized, like, getting involved in that space, and I sought out different opportunities, and I did enjoy a lot of the work I did. I just think I had more, because it was so internally driven, I had a lot of indecision, because it felt like, oh, there's no one telling me what to do.
Right.
There's no opportunity just jumping out at me, or opportunity being taken away that's like informing my choices. So you want to find a balance, and I think that's the part that's part of why people like to be bi-coastal, I think, is that there's a certain way you like the idea of being able to balance those internal and external factors. But it doesn't always work, and it is a whole other undertaking to actually be a bi-coastal person.
Yeah.
Financially and otherwise,
Yeah.
So I'm excited for the I feel like there's got to be another place that has creative opportunities, or I mean, I know other places have creative opportunities, but has maybe less of these push and pull qualities to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think because LA and New York are just so huge and like set, we know that these creative communities have been here for a really long time and will be in both of those places for a really long time, regardless of what anybody might be saying about New York right now, which I am like, I get so mad anytime I hear anyone talk poorly about New York right now. It's so annoying. But the creative community is going to be here. Like, there's just, it might not be the people that, you know, lived here in the 90s or early 2000s or something that think they know. It changes neighborhoods, it changes form, it changes people. Like, I don't know. Anybody that says that, like, the cool New York is dead is just, they're old. I mean, and they're like maybe you just need to look and open your eyes and find it, you know?
Right. Yeah. Or my caveat, I'll just like, I said all of that about LA. I'll say the same thing about New York. Yeah. I'm not, like, it's not that I don't think this place is creatively fulfilling in any way. It's just about what's right for you. Yeah. At any given point. But it's always going to have that creative energy to it.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't think that you were. I know. You're not the person I'm talking about. There's all these articles coming out and stuff. But,
yeah, I know.
But in terms of, I was mostly thinking that in terms of like where another place could be.
Yeah.
And I think it's hard because a lot of other cities, I think their creative potential isn't set in stone yet. Like, there's these like Austin or Nashville or even like Chicago, and like a lot of these places have had creative types of people in them for a while, but they're just not quite as like substantial as New York or LA, or like withstanding, or
I mean, I'm sure people from those areas would argue differently. I think I've like had a bunch of stuff written down about this, and I don't think this is where it's going to come out today either, but maybe it will one time. But I think maybe the difference between areas like that and like a New York or an LA is its greatest strength is its greatest weakness, which is just this level of conceitedness that is so extreme, where it's like, no, it'll never die, and if you're gonna leave, see ya, you know, like there's there, and even if it got down to the very bottom of the barrel where it was like dead, or even if it was dead for 20 years, eventually it's going to rise again, and then the narrative is self-fulfilling. It's always like, it was awful back then and I survived it. And like there's always going to be somebody that's going to tell a story about New York or LA probably that will glorify whatever was considered the dead time.
Yeah.
So, but then you know the consequence of that is that you're constantly having to defend what is a terrible situation sometimes, you know?
But I also think, I think what you're realizing, Nina, because you're not really, I think in your comparison between New York and LA, you're not really saying like the city is good, or like you're not really placing a judgment, which I appreciate. I think you're noticing like what it brings out in you and like how you interact with it, which I think is what I think is just what I mean, like when people are saying, oh, New York is dead, maybe it's just that they're not interested in like interacting with New York anymore. Maybe they're not in the river. Maybe they're like on the river banks watching it. Or maybe they are in the river and can't see it moving. I don't know.
They're either not interested in being in the river anymore, or they're on the riverbank and afraid of jumping back in.
Maybe
and that's fine. Either way is okay. I think it's also, I was going to just say like the climates, it's a funny comparison also, but I guess it also serves the purpose of what I'm saying is like a lake or a pond is pretty like, it's a stagnant body of water.
Yeah.
LA is almost always the same weather. New York has constantly shifting seasons.
Sure.
And those seasons inform the energy and the culture here in a really distinct way. So again, that just like comes back to this way that like they're both creative hubs, but because of the environment around them, that's part of what informs it. You know, like people will do really big things in LA because they don't have any other distractions, or because they need to force some change, some kind of shift in themselves or in the people, their audience. Whereas I think in New York, it's a lot of contextualizing what's happening in the world around us and recognizing how to mediate that for audiences. That's another way I might phrase it. But yeah, I think New York will always have some real distinct self-referential self-absorbedness, and so will LA.
Yeah.
I was going to say there was like a short essay I feel like everybody's had to read about pretension.
Okay.
That was either Ira Glass or Tony, Angels in America, Tony. Guy that wrote Angels in America. Anyway.
Yeah.
Just about the idea, like, pretension is not a bad thing. Pretension is the great ambition to supersede yourself, you know, to pretend the world is different, pretend that life is better than it might be, to have that highfalutin, high-minded thought, and to aim for it, and by doing it, raise yourself up, which I think ties in a certain way to this kind of self-absorption or this sort of like ego mindset. Yeah, I don't know. I generally try to avoid good and bad. Like, it's a hard thing not to. And I certainly feel positive and negative emotions, but I don't want to put that judgment on a place, especially.